So how fun is this going to be? Cynthia, to have you on the Leaders Who Care series. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's going to be fun, no doubt, Mark.
It always is. You bring positive energy to the table, and people are going to see in a second why you deserve to be on a Leaders Who Care series. Not to put too much pressure on you, of course, but it will be fun. And I think the best place to start would be if you could give a brief introduction of yourself, where you're from originally, where you are now, family, favorite color, maybe something you've never told anybody ever you want to reveal to the world right now. You think that could be cool, or shattering news, breaking news, that kind of thing. So
I
and
have
then
to think
we'll
about that.
and then we'll get into the business stuff. How's that?
Okay, sure. That sounds good. So I have a bit of an unusual story. I actually was adopted from Korea as a baby. So I actually started off my life as an orphan in Korea. I don't have, and I have an official birth date that was assigned to me, but I actually don't have any proof of when I was born or even exactly where I was born, which is kind of interesting.
But you
Uh,
were
I assume I was born, which is like spraying as a fully formed 1 year old. Anyway, but I was really lucky to be adopted by a fantastic family in the US. And my parents also adopted another child a few years later from within the US. So this is also what makes it unusual. So obviously I'm ethnically Korean, my parents are white, and my sister is black. And so it's great because
great.
it's our reality. So it's we think it's great. But it is unusual, and then of course that that colors a bit of the way you see the world. So I grew up on the west coast of the U.S. In that kind of a series of small towns that tended to be very white, often conservative. That also is different when you're from that kind of family. Uh, but really had a fantastic childhood, had a lot of opportunity, particularly because at that time, in the 80s in particular in California, there was a lot of investment in innovation in education. So I was part of some really cutting edge programs, both in Washington State and then in California. Uh, so feel fortunate to have that experience. And that went to university also on the West Coast, and that was kind of the springboard for a lot of the travel and how I've ended up where I am. Very much a citizen of the world, cliche as that sounds. I like this idea of home is where you make it, home is where your family is. And still very close to my family in the US, but have my own nuclear family here, and we're in Switzerland, and we make home and identity and place what we want it to be.
I love it. So you have kids?
I do. I have kids. You might actually hear them in the background, but they've been told not to come in the door.
No,
Um,
these days that's part of life. It's so
it
great that
is.
you can have serious conversations and not take ourselves so seriously that
That's
you
so
don't have to.
true.
It comes in. I've had dogs come in, and I
Yeah.
really actually love the dogs coming in.
My
Yeah.
kids want a dog. We don't have a dog, but
Okay.
they come in and out of my calls all the time. So yeah, my kids are 13 and almost 10. My son will be 10 next week.
Yeah, well, I got older ones in their 20s, and it goes fast, as we all hear. But
Oh,
it really
yeah,
does. Cherish the
yeah, yeah.
moments. So, speaking of kids, then, and that's a fascinating background, by the way. I was talking to my daughter-in-law, who's from Denmark, and not that you just reminded me of how we have these expressions of stepkids and stepmoms and this and that.
Hmm.
Call them bonus kids, bonus moms, bonus dads,
Oh, I
and
like that.
the movies have made step so generally evil when you in a movie.
Mm.
Bonus
Hmm.
this, bonus that. I thought it was fantastic. So sharing that, it's a good way to go. Um, I think out there for people it's positive. But so what were you like as a kid and a teenager? Were you a big reader? Did learning different languages? Were you organizing people all the time? Or what were you doing? What was interesting for
I
you?
think I was doing everything, and that's what I. But not because I was pushed to do everything, but just because I liked lots of things. So I did music, I did sports, I read a lot, I wrote a lot, I did kind of social activism stuff. I just did a lot of different things. I did theater as well. I taught music, I taught theater at one point, and so it was just this. I don't know, insatiable curiosity and just the desire to do lots of different things I had. a lot of different friends. I've got a really nice core group of friends with whom I'm still close, but lots of other friends as well, lots of different groups. So not buying in so much to the kind of the cliquey high school bit, but just being more of a connector. And I still like to do lots of things, and I get bored easily. So I like to do a lot of different things. I like to read multiple books at a time and have multiple conversations and spend a lot of my time in conversations like this, just because I think it feeds my soul.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say soul, because there's been a lot of studies, I'm sure you know, about the thing that fills people's hearts and souls more than anything is belonging. And
Yes.
and with blue zones show it all the time, and everything. So I can get that. I can also get being bored and wanting to do more stuff. Totally get that for sure. So tell us about a little bit about your journey. You started in Tacoma.
Mm-hmm.
There's an Asian studies and English lit. Then you became an English teacher in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. So what
Yeah.
made you to take that path initially, and then coming back to the States, and et cetera, et cetera. But let's start with the education path.
So I think a lot of it is interesting inflection points. So when I went to university, I was interested in going to a kind of a smaller liberal arts university because of that idea of learning to learn and not specializing immediately. And actually, I went to the University of Puget Sound, which is in Tacoma. And one of the big selling points of that was the Pacific Rim Asia Study Travel Program, which I ended up doing. And I think that was incredibly pivotal. So that's how I ended up with the second bachelor's in Asian studies. So I started as an English major. I was originally an English and music double major. Dropped the music to a minor, but because I just wanted to continue to love music and not make it my job. Um, but then that Pacific Rim program is phenomenal because it takes 30 students around the Pacific Rim for an academic year. And you actually apply a year and a half before. You do a year's worth of coursework. You do a year on the course. Then you write a thesis and defend the thesis. And I actually had my thesis double as my master's thesis. I did a classics-based honors program at the same time there. And so it was this confluence of a bunch of different influences that then, basically kind of put me on this path of, looking outward, being connected with the world, kind of reconnecting with Asia as well, which also then plays into this idea of place and identity. But I think that was incredibly formative because that's actually what then made it attractive to go back to Asia via that Japan exchange and teaching program. So that's how I ended up in Japan, which was fascinating because being in Japan at that time, this was mid 90s, and being in Japan in a rural area as a woman who's not Japanese, who's also Asian, had so many layers and was fascinating. Not all of it pleasant, like 99% of it fantastic, but it just added another layer of that experience. But it was really great because that also helped me think about what I liked about education, what I thought I could influence. It also made me realize I didn't want to be a teacher as my primary profession, but what I did like about it was educational exchange, citizen exchange. And so that was actually what drove me when I came back to the US to look into ways I could continue that path. So that's how I ended up running admissions for an international teacher exchange program. There was a funny pivot there. So I thought coming back from Japan, I wanted to actually do a PhD in comparative literature. And I didn't get into any of the programs where I applied. And so then I thought, well, okay, that's a sign. Maybe that's not for me. And maybe I don't want to be an academic or not only an academic. And so that also made me think about what I liked about the job that I was coming out of and what I wanted to do. And so when I came back, I did more reflection, looked for jobs that were related to citizen exchange and educational exchange. And that's how I ended up at Amity Institute, which was that teacher exchange program. And that basically led then to the idea of other kinds of citizen exchange in the professional exchange program that I ran later, that was that public-private partnership with the State Department.
Yeah, I love so much of what you said there. And one line that really caught me when you said you loved learning to learn. We talk about going to college, going this and that, and I don't know if there's enough attention spent on where, learning where things came from, where they derive from, how are things derived. How
Mm-hmm.
do you learn? How do you engage beyond just the information, if you will?
Exactly. Because it's not the information, it's what you do with the information. You have to have the mindset, the tools, the ability, the freedom to figure out what you do with the information.
Yeah, you were brilliant in getting involved in international early for whatever the impetus was or whatnot. And there was a number of things. And I also find it fascinating. There was so much alignment, except for the part you weren't Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And they noticed that sometimes.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's what makes it a more interesting story. So a lot of people would not notice. I had one random kid on the street in a big city, like point at me and say I was Korean. But that was the only time.
There's always one kid.
Yeah, it was just like some kid on a school trip. Um, but a lot of people didn't notice. And then even people in my little community would say that they would forget that I wasn't Japanese. And I mean, my Japanese is not great. So it wasn't because of that. It was just more I was part of the community and people would forget. Uh, and so there were good things about people forgetting because you get to be a fly on the wall. You get to really be embedded. At the same time, there are expectations that come with that, about that you will know the social decorum, you will know the right things to do, you will know how not to be rude. And so things like that were more difficult looking like me than they would be looking like you. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's also yeah, it was part of that whole experience.
Yeah, it is a double-edged sword, and that's a whole other. Maybe that's something we'll do in another series. But that's a whole aspect of embracing those differences and what they mean and what they could be, rather than figuring out who's different type of thing
Mm-hmm.
for other
Mm-hmm.
reasons. Moving on something else. We actually founded Fifth Element based on the premise that leaders in their businesses can do way better when they're doing good at the same time. So you were an early leader, I think, in that thinking from different ventures you've done, including even strategic consulting for nonprofits, if
Mm-hmm.
correctly. Can you describe what it was like working in places like San Diego and Seattle, and then London, and then Geneva, different cultures, how those experiences basically framed your work forward with the World Economic Forum and now Adecco's Innovation Foundation?
Yeah. I think part of it is figuring out what is the core of the way you operate and the way you develop relationships, and then what are the margins that flex. So I think that's a lot of how working in those different places and working in the nonprofit sector, working in public-private partnership, working in a for-profit company serving the nonprofit sector, they're all kind of different lenses on the same topics. Uh, but then figuring out what was inherent to what I bring to the table and how I operate, and then how I would, slightly shift that um, depending on the context, but without losing the core. And so this was one of the things I found when I went to work first in London was, there are lots of commonalities between the US and the UK. There are lots of differences as well. And one of the things that's hugely different in the US, in US business culture, it's okay to basically tell people what you think and give feedback, and feedback is often welcomed. And in the consulting firm that I joined, I expected that to be more of the same. And then one of my early reviews, I was told that I was scaring people, because I don't feel like a scary person, but I needed to just change how I was giving that feedback, how I was doing the development of people, how I was managing. And so it didn't change the core of what I believe is right about relationships and management and development, but it was rather the packaging had to be slightly different.
Yeah, that's actually brilliant because we'll talk about influencers later, but I've had people tell me, one Deloitte partner told me, he said brilliance is simple, stick to your passion, stick to your core values, and tell the truth and be authentic. He was saying,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got a solid foundation that people will see it's consistent, and then go around it. Sounds a little bit like what you're talking about. Um, and telling the truth is, excuse me, you don't have, if you tell your truth, as my mom used to say, you don't have to worry about what you told everybody.
That's
After
true.
just got one consistent message. Um,
Yeah.
it is fascinating that there's are different ways in different cultures, which is fun actually, and educational and whatnot. And at the same time, everybody wants the same thing. What yours at? So to your point about the core, I think that's totally right on. And related to that is we've noticed that the fifth industrial revolution is about humanity. The fourth is about technology, AI, VR, AR, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the fifth is really about humanity. And it's actually one of the reasons we're called Fifth Element is that where we focus on impact and talent coming together. Partnerships, sustainable results. Tell us about your opportunity that you saw at the Innovation Foundation. Because when I first met you, as I've told you this a million times, I was fascinated how you're approaching a foundation. And to Adecco's credit, allowing that to happen too, I guess, would be important. But how did that begin and how did it evolve? And then how do you balance the economic viability of it along with the social and environmental impact?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that also has a number of dimensions. So when we started the foundation in 2017, it was set up more like a traditional foundation, but it wasn't even traditional then, because it was essentially an umbrella for things that were being pulled out of the group and put in the foundation to drive synergy. So even that configuration was an unusual genesis story. So I went looking when I first started out for other models like that and didn't find any. So even in that very early stage, that was a different model, which I think also speaks well of the Adecco group. It was willing to come up with something that was different already from the get-go. And so I inherited those building blocks and did a broad assessment of, what did we have, what did we need, what did the landscape look like, where should we play, stitch those things together. And then very quickly set up the Social Innovation Lab as kind of a springboard off of some of those legacy pieces and ran those in parallel. And they were actually very synergistic, the legacy programs and the Social Innovation Lab. But what I found is that portfolio kept growing and becoming more and more diverse. So it started pulling in different directions. So there was music, there was youth, there was health, there was athletes, there, sustainability at one point sat in my team. There were different things, which individually are really good, but as a portfolio, they pull themselves apart. So when we had the change of chairman in 2020, we actually then agreed that we would do a review with the board and decide where we should play to have the most impact. So by the end of that review, at the end of 2020, then the board agreed we would just narrow the focus. So we wouldn't have all these different broad things, but would just focus on employability and access to labor markets for underserved populations. And this is the bit that also is complementary to the group, but not the same as what the Adecco group does. The Adecco group does employability and employment for everybody. And we're looking for who's left out of that equation. And so that meant that we're not in competition with the group, but we're also not feeding the pipeline of the group because legally we're not allowed to do that either. So we then, once we had that clear mandate and the mandate for the new configuration, we spent 2021 spinning all of the legacy stuff off and rehousing it. So either back in the group or off with a partner and building up the pipeline of the new projects. At the same time, this was unprecedented. We did a rename and a rebrand, which kind of took us by surprise. We hadn't planned that, but actually it was perfect because it meant that we ended up with something that reflected better what we do. We also restructured the board, rewrote the statutes. So basically by the beginning of 2022, we were a new organization. So based on, compared to where we were when we started in 2017, we have none of the original board members. We have none of the original staff. And that all just kind of came through evolution. People spun off or found other opportunities. The board changed over because of general attrition. We were able to bring in external board members. And all of that means that we're now the organization that's better suited to what we're going to achieve. And so that's what's really exciting. I think what's exciting now is looking at how do we scan for who's falling out? How do we build the possible solutions? How we scale those solutions and spin them off? And then most importantly, how we measure the impact of that. Because this is not a model that exists anywhere else within a corporate foundation. So we're pushing these boundaries of what a foundation can be. we borrowed from lots of other stuff that's out there. So we're not claiming that this is original, but it means that the traditional measurement mechanisms don't suit what we are doing. So when someone says, why are you creating more value? How are you creating more value? By creating these solutions that you're going to then scale across these populations and these communities versus giving money directly to that NGO working on the ground in that country. And my feeling is, we've got the ripple effect. That's going to be the game changer. At the same time, we've got to have the data that shows that, because otherwise it's very easy to come back and say, well, we could have just given money to that NGO, and then we know exactly how many people benefited. So it's tricky, but we want to be part of that narrative too.
I think you're creating the foundation for innovation, to tell you the truth.
I hope so. Part of what we do is we open source everything. And we agreed this with the board from the beginning is, we share our methodology, we share our learnings, we share our case studies, we share everything so that others can take it, use it, change it. As long as it's out there in the world being used, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, because just giving money, I mean, we're always looking with clients for, there's all types of alternative types of capital. There is philanthropic, but there's also marketing dollars, investment dollars, CSR dollars, HR dollars, to make an impact. And you definitely got to measure it, because that's how you find out where, if it's going in the right direction and it's getting better, whatever. But because you're also getting the NGOs involved anyway from what you're doing. And so talk a little bit about, we love working in untapped talent, like we've talked about, incarcerated, veterans, refugees, etc. Tell us a little bit about the one that you're doing now in Mexico with moms coming back. And there's so many, you talked about layers before, there's so many good things that happen, in no particular order: getting moms back to work, giving people dignity, giving their family dignity, showing their kids how it could be rather than hopeless as it was before, et cetera, and how it benefits the community in general. I can go on about the value of stuff. A lot of it can be measured. Some of it can't be measured. You got to just feel it and hear it. Tell us about that program and how it impacts all of that.
Sure. So we actually started with the topic of youth and looking at within youth, who is the most underserved and the farthest away from the world of work. So not underserved in terms of, say, absolute poverty. We don't deal specifically with poverty, but really in terms of furthest away from the world of work. So we started with young people, and then we looked at NEET, so not in employment, education, or training. We looked age-wise at 16 to 24, because in a lot of countries you can leave work at the age of 16. And if you fall out of the whole system, then you fall out of education, you maybe get into a job, but probably a low skill, low paid job, and you're likely stuck there. So statistically, we looked at, what are the danger zones there. We then looked at socioeconomic level, and shows at or below the poverty line and on the urban fringe. Because if you're urban, you've got access to certain resources. If you're rural, then you definitely have, other challenges about lack of access. So we chose that. And then we wanted a more extreme use case. So we zoomed in on young mothers, essentially teenage mothers, or women who had recently been teenage mothers or young mothers, because they tend to be more socially marginalized. They're also more time and resource constrained. So we thought, if we can crack what works for them, then it will work for other young people, it will work for other mothers, it will work for other marginalized groups as well. So we did more needs finding there to understand what was keeping them out of work. And it's not out of employment, but out of the world of work. And we zoomed in on two things. One was that they didn't have credible information and a way to curate it and filter, like what's for me versus all the information that's out there telling me get a job or go to school or do whatever. But I need someone who looks like me, sounds like me, who understands my experience, who's going to say, hey, this is what you could do. Right. So it's that first kind of step into, I could learn more about this. So one of the things that we're building now is a campaign that would be based on getting that information into the hands of these women. And then the other piece that we've found was they were being told by all different sorts of people that they had no skills. If you've never been in work or never been in formal work, you have no skills, you're not going to have a job, let alone a career. You should be satisfied to be a mother, and that's a worthy thing, and that should be enough. And so, and maybe for some people that is enough. There's no judgment in this. It's basically do you have the information, the tools, and the mindset to then make an informed choice about how you want to engage with the world of work? And it might be you want to be a dedicated 100% mother. That's great, as long as you know there's something else and you've made that conscious choice. And what we found with that population is they weren't having enough information and the tools available to make that choice. And part of it was being able to identify and make known the skills that they already had from lived experience. So the other product that we're building now is actually a tech tool that will help to bridge this gap between lived experience and what would actually make you more employable. And those two things together basically are, the aim is to reconnect this whole population that is very far from the world of work back into the system of kind of pathways to employment, so that they can then they can link back into the systems, the services, the tools that are available already in their local community through the NGO partners we're working with, through other providers, through government, through whomever. But it's basically put you back on the path, reconnect the pipes, so then you can start to make other choices. But this is where it's hard to measure. Just because you saw a campaign, you went to the website, you clicked on that, you set up a profile, you did this, that assessment, that doesn't necessarily mean you're more employable or you're on the path to employment. But what we're hoping is we can create the right metrics to basically show kind of general reach and then conversion, to show that enough people took steps toward getting on that path to employment, that then we can show what the overall impact is.
I love the fact you told me that you went out on the street and found moms, and
Yes.
and and the whole part about, I want to see the face of that mom smiling and realizing, I never in a million years thought I could do this. I never in a million years thought I was anybody, type of thing. And how my kids are going to look up to me now, and all that you can measure, but you can't totally measure. You have to feel it sometimes too. And,
Yes.
and then it does go into the community, because to your point about, seeing someone who's done it, then people like other moms like her or her see they did it, and they start evangelizing to those other moms about, look what I did, etc., etc. It's not rocket science, but it does take the work you're doing, but the value over time, especially to the families and community, is huge.
That's the idea. And it's really to create those stories and to create momentum through those stories. And by building a community, the idea is that community has to be curated, maybe by us in the beginning, but ultimately curated by people from the community themselves. And so the idea is you build up people who can then bring others in, can facilitate, can curate, can grow that, because that's the only way it will be sustainable. But it's about finding the right anchor organizations and finding the right anchor people who then become the influencers that will make that sustainable.
Yeah, super, super, super cool, and really making an impact. So, in LA, we say, leave them wanting more so you can do a sequel. So we're probably definitely going to have to do a sequel.
With pleasure.
But I have a couple quick, maybe quick.
Sure.
Um, we launched, as I said before, on International Women's Day 5 years ago, our company, for a reason. And that's the other half of why we're called Fifth Element, is SDG 5. We engage with a lot of, not to be cute, leaders who care, and they understand the value of diversity, but they more understand the value of inclusion. Because if you don't have inclusion, diversity is okay, but not great.
Yes.
Can you describe what you have to some degree, but what it's like being a woman in business? You talked about before being Asian, Japanese, Korean, all that, but being a woman in business over different eras and different thought process and different ways of thinking, etc., and different cultures you've been in, how you've navigated and thrived to be able to be in a position to actually make an impact.
So I think a lot of it is about figuring out how to leverage that difference, but not trade on it. So what I found early on was I would get invited to lots of women's networking, women's empowerment groups, which in theory are great, but actually can have the effect of ghettoizing or just becoming kind of a bitch session. And that's not helpful either. But it's more, how do you choose the alliances you're going to make? How do you choose what you're going to take from your experience? And then figure out how to apply that in a way that is additive and inclusive, and that it's not, hey, look at me because I'm blah, 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 but rather I bring other things to the table. I can speak this language and bring these people in. I can act as the bridge. And so that, I think, is how I've tried to leverage more. And I think also letting go of being annoyed by things. I think early on, I was also annoyed by not being heard or assumptions being made, or snide comments, whatever. And then eventually you just don't care and you just get on with it. And I think that's actually really helpful. I think actually parenthood helped a lot with that too. You become maybe more laid back as a parent because there's lots of stuff that you just can't control and you just have to let it go. And so I think, I don't know, older, wiser, maybe more flexible, I hope.
Well, yeah, and learning. Yeah, but you did have to try. I've had the good fortune of working with women as bosses, and I saw how much harder they had to work. Even when I started
Yes.
at Deloitte and had to do, and it really impressed me, and they were great influences for me. And but you're right. You can spend a lot of energy being annoyed and hating and all that, and it's wasted energy. So it's a good for you on that. Last
Some
question.
of it's also bringing people along. That's the other thing I think is really important. And that there are a lot of anecdotes about women bosses and women leaders who don't. And I think that's really a shame. I think you should always be aware of giving somebody else a hand up. And I spend a lot of time doing informational interviews and just chatting with people, making suggestions, making connections. You have to do that.
Yeah, there was one congresswoman that talked recently about she's a single mom, kids, the whole bit, divorce, everything, and she said, there's more women now in Congress, but a lot of them came on either because something happened with their husband and they took their seat, or they came on after
Mm-hmm.
kids and everything, and they're not necessarily helping the ones and don't understand the flexibility the single moms need to travel to Washington, to travel this and that, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
do stuff, and it's a different time and whatnot. So yeah, people have to help. In 2021, just to complete here a little bit, in 2021, a client told me, Mark, the year 2020 was the year that flew by slowly.
Mm.
I thought, what a great line. And
Yeah.
the last few years have been kind of like a blur. Feels like yesterday and feels like forever ago.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, that's very true.
with that in mind, can you share what you're most grateful for and also what you're most hopeful for?
I think I'm most grateful for the ability to see the human side of people. What you said about, kids and dogs and people come through. And I love the fact that people are not uptight about that anymore. Everyone is human. Everybody has some family, some story, some life behind. So I think that is actually the thing I'm most grateful for. And I think that links to what I'm most hopeful for as well. Back to what you're saying about, the fourth industrial revolution and the fifth. I think they're linked because the fourth industrial revolution at its heart should have the idea of technology in service of humanity.
Right.
And so if they're together, I think that's actually what you're seeing more. And even if you look at something like ChatGPT, it's now the narrative is around how are we going to work with that? How are we going to make sure that it serves humanity, that it doesn't replace humanity? And I think that's what I'm really excited about going forward.
Well, what a great way to complete. Thank you so much for being a leader who cares. For sure. I told you everybody she was. And for sharing all that. We really appreciate you and for being on the series.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.